missile defense whatsoever. 8 out of every 10 missiles and virtually most so-called drones are penetrating without opposition. So Israel is really in very bad shape. Now, as far as we're concerned, we need to keep in mind that all of the very expensive radars that we had installed across the region have been destroyed, which means we have great difficulty picking up on a lot of these missiles that are shot at us until, frankly, they're almost on top of us. And then finally, remember that we're 7,000 miles away from the United States. So when you're replenishing your stocks, which is what is happening right now, the replenishment has to come from the United States, thousands of miles. Then it has to be loaded. It has to be loaded onto aircraft, loaded onto ships all the time. And that's what this pause is all about. And I think then there will be an attempt to launch what they hope will be a war-winning offensive. And I don't think it's going to turn out that way at all. I think this is something for which the Iranians are prepared for over 20 years.
And the Americans do?
No, of course not. You know, our manufacturing base has shrunken dramatically. We don't have the capacity that we did 40 or 50 years ago to surge production. We're not in the same position as Russia and China right now militarily at all. I think we just grossly miscalculated. We assumed things that were untrue. We assumed that we could bully Iran. We assumed that Iran could be isolated. And I think we completely missed the boat on the economic catastrophe that we're creating globally. You're feeling the impact of this in India. You know that your citizens are lining up in order to fill their gas tanks, and that's no pleasure. You have a similar situation in Japan. This is happening in Europe. Now, the Russians, of course, are making more than $250 million a day more than they previously did. But the Russians and the Chinese both want an end to this because they see supply chains being destroyed. And if we press ahead with this next war-winning offensive, I think that will finish off all the oil infrastructure in the Persian Gulf. Because the Iranians have said very clearly, if you attack our infrastructure, our oil infrastructure, our desalinification, we will wipe out everything in the Gulf. This has got to stop. And President Trump has to recognize that whatever advice he got was bad. Ought to fire everybody working for him right now in the White House.
Maybe there's some realization that's why this attempt to shift the onus on Israel or on Pete Hegseth. But Colonel, one interesting observation you made in your last answer, which was that the Iranian warfare this time has pivoted a lot on space-based intelligence. Now, so far as I know, they do not have satellites. Who's providing them this space-based intelligence?
The Chinese and the Russians. And as a result, anything that moves within 1,000 miles of Iran is immediately identified and picked up. And that information is linked near simultaneously to all of the strike systems on the ground inside Iran. Russia and China have no interest in seeing Iran destroyed by us. They don't have any interest in seeing the society disintegrate. No one in the region wants Iran to become a basket case that the Israelis and Americans can run in, take over the oil fields in their wildest imagination, and essentially divide Iran into smaller bits and pieces, driving millions of people, refugees, into Syria, Turkey, Arabia, and ultimately Europe. None of this is desirable. So again, everybody miscalculated because I think Trump listened far, far too much to the Israelis. And the Israelis promised a short, decisive war.
Yeah.
Now they're paying the ultimate price.
You mentioned the Israelis. Look at the situation in Israel, Abhishek. And Colonel, I'm sure you've gone through these reports of the Israeli Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir. He's warned that the IDF could collapse in on itself due to the shortage of soldiers.
They're fatigue that's building.
Fatigue. And the multi-war...
Maybe not as many casualties, but the sheer fatigue of having been in a war. Remember, not for the last 1 month, for the last 2 years, 3 years.
Well, of course, keep something in mind. We don't true numbers of casualties for ourselves as well as for the Israelis. No one in Washington or Tel Aviv or Jerusalem is interested in telling anybody the truth right now. And this is not new. We've always slow-rolled casualties in all our wars. But right now, I suspect that we have all sustained far more casualties than we're admitting. As far as the Israelis are concerned, they've depended very heavily on air power for their military strength. They've always had a small army, a small regular force augmented by hundreds of thousands of reservists. This can't work over time. They're running out of steam, not just people, but they're exhausted They have had lots of losses. But I think the Israelis bet heavily that we would be their infantry as well as their artillery and their air power. That hasn't worked out well.
Yeah. And luckily, both Trump and Netanyahu are now facing this unique situation where there is massive opposition. Republicans themselves questioning Donald Trump. So a few of those comments come in. People are unhappy. In Israel, the opposition is questioning Netanyahu. By the way, where is Netanyahu? Nobody knows. I saw a report today, Abhishek, Colonel, that mentioned that maybe his flight was spotted in Berlin. He's been in Berlin for the last 2 weeks. I don't know where he is, but it appears extremely shady at the moment.
Yeah, you're right. I have no idea where he is. I would be careful, though, of the American situation. Go back to President Trump's State of the Union address, and when he talked about stopping Iran from having a nuclear weapon and taking whatever action was required, he got a standing ovation from virtually everybody in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, because they've all effectively been bought by the Israel lobby. And the billionaires that back the Israel lobby have bought up these candidates. And as a result, I have almost no sympathy whatsoever for Congress. They're as culpable in all of this nonsense as is the president. But the president, if he wants to get out of this mess, should not continue to do what doesn't work. Remember the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and over again in the expectation that you're going to get a different result. This next war-winning assault is not going to win the war. What he ought to do at this point is fire the people around him, step forward and say, look, I was wrong. This was a mistake. I'm disengaging. If he were willing to do that, then large numbers of people in the world, I think, leaders would come and assist him to mediate an end to this tragedy. That's one of the reasons that I mentioned Prime Minister Modi previously. But there are others that could come in as well, people that all sides could trust. That's what we desperately need. We don't need an extension of this war.
Yes. Couple of last questions, last two, and I'll take one, Abhishek, and you can take one on Karg Island. I wanted to ask Colonel Macgregor on, and you can take that, and I'll take the one on Pakistan, because you've spoken about Pakistan. You know, this joke of a country called Pakistan wants to mediate on the war. What's happening on that front? What are you hearing? Are they really mediating? Is there a mediation at all?
You know, I have my doubts. I don't know. I mean, at this point, I don't think President Trump would turn away anybody who offered help. But whether or not that means anything, I mean, he says we're holding talks. What I've seen in the past is that the CIA and Mossad will pick people out of a government, people at levels below the senior leadership, and start conversing with them in the hopes that they can be co-opted or bribed. And ultimately, that'll help us win whatever we want to win. That's not going to work with Iran. The Mossad was already in there and bought people up.
They're acting as a courier.
When he says he's talking to someone in Iran, who is he talking to?
Yeah. Well, that's the whole point. None of us really knows. And that's why I think the intelligence agencies are talking to generals or colonels or somebody somewhere in the hopes that this is going to be a breakthrough. I think it's just nonsense. I think you can't believe much of what's coming out of Washington right now. Everyone is desperate, even though we project this air of confidence. The truth is, behind the scenes, the president is quite desperate. He recognizes at this stage that he was lied to, and he made some bad calls. Well, the only way to get out of it is to admit that and disengage and ask for help from others. That's the only way. But at the moment, the plan is to do what I said before, be insane, double down on what has failed in the past and hope that it works. It's not going to happen. I don't care how many little islands they try to seize in the Persian Gulf. You put people on an island that's perhaps 14 or 15 square kilometers and a few intermediate range ballistic missiles or tactical ballistic missiles and drones, and everybody on the island is dead. This is not 1944. This is not 1984. This is 2026. Warfare is different. It's changed.
Well, it is 1984 in the sense that war is peace. But Colonel Macgregor, my question is, if the weaponry is depleted, as you suggest, if the leadership is so clueless as to where to take this next, how then are you saying that the United States is going to double down? There are no weapons, there is no direction. How do you double down? You can't.
Well, that's why you have a break right now. This is why you've got this phony pause. It's not for peace talks, it's to replenish the stocks. So I think they're bringing in whatever we still have in the United States sitting on the shelves and bringing it out to the theater. That's what's happening to the Navy and the Air Force. And at the same time, whenever air campaigns fail historically, we then turn to the use of ground forces. That's what happened to us in Vietnam with Rolling Thunder. I went through this during the Kosovo air campaign that lasted 78 days. And by 60 days into the campaign, it was obvious it wasn't working. And there were tremendous efforts to try and press President Clinton to commit ground forces. Ultimately, he refused to, and instead we managed to bribe the Russians to pull the plug on Milosevic in Serbia and end the campaign. This is a dumb idea. Anytime you go into any fight and you take the approach that you're going to use air power only because you don't want casualties, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Colonel Macgregor, you just gave, half a dozen, the list of 83 attempts or successes that the United States has had on regime change, this time perhaps failing,
Expended early on in this campaign. We think that we spent somewhere between 12 and $16 billion in one of the most intense air campaigns in American history in the first 3 or 4 days of the fight with Iran. So I think it's fair to say we're in a lot of trouble. There are certainly recriminations going back and forth. There is no doubt that President Trump has to assume responsibility for the fact that he listened first and foremost to the Israelis and certainly did not pay much attention to people here in the United States that warned him not to do what he's done.
Yeah. Are you suggesting that there's some people who wanted to not have this war and advised as such to the president and he did not listen to them? Because we have not heard something like that, coming out of American reports.
Yes, I think so. Obviously, I've known him for a long time. And, I advised him when I last spoke with him not to do a lot of things, to end the war in Ukraine quickly. While I was working for him in 2020, I said, Iran is a potential strategic partner. We should not look upon them as the enemy and so forth. All of that fell on deaf ears. Remember, he surrounded himself with these New York City billionaires who are all very loyal to the Israeli agenda. And he took a lot of money from these people in order to be elected as president of the United States. So I think when he was elected, he knew that at some point he was going to have to deliver on the promises he made. So I don't think he was really fully apprised of what was going on. Iran, a nation of 93 million, half the size of India, is not going to surrender to anybody. There's no reason why they should. They can absorb a lot of punishment, and they've demonstrated a new way of war, the 21st century way of war, which is linking space-based intelligence and reconnaissance to numerous strike weapons all over, enabling them in the space of a few minutes to concentrate enormous firepower wherever they want to put it. That's why any talk right now about invading Iran is absurd. Any talk about seizing islands in the Persian Gulf is an invitation to disaster.
Yeah.
No one has to sit on those islands to defend them. They can attack them from numerous locations inside Iran.
Okay, go ahead.
You need to understand that for Iran, this is existential. Remember what President Trump said about this initially. Oh, this is just a journey. This is a journey. In other words, it's not existential for us. A journey in which we've decided that we're going to bring a nation of 93 million people to its knees. We're going to destroy its way of life, its existence. But for us, it's just a journey. Well, why is it just a journey for us? Because it's a journey for Israel. And that's the problem. This is the problem that people don't understand. We cannot solve Israel's strategic problems militarily, which is what we're being asked to do right now. Israel was already widely disliked, if not treated as a pariah in the region anyway. Now, the rest of the Islamic world sees Israel as this menace, this virus that is going to ultimately destroy all of them. And all you have to do is look at the map of Greater Israel. The map of Greater Israel includes much of Saudi Arabia, northern Iraq, Syria, Jordan, the Sinai, and some territory west of the Nile, and of course, at least half of Lebanon. And all of this is part of so-called Greater Israel. Well, we used to have something during World War II called Greater Germany, Großdeutschland. This was the expanded Germany. Ultimately, that actually made more sense than what we're seeing, because at least there were Germans living on the territory, not always in the majority, but there. In this case, we're talking about whole populations that have to be subjected to Gaza treatment. They're going to have to be effectively subjugated, enslaved, or driven out. This is insane. And this is what we are fighting for. People need to understand this. And I don't see any evidence that it could possibly exist. We've always had the objective of gaining control of the oil fields in the region. You've got to go back into the 1990s and go back and read the things that Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and a host of others in their group of neocons were writing and insisting that if we could control all the oil resources in the Middle East, then we would have China by the throat. Of course, the real intention was not just to have China by the throat, but to make Israel the undisputed champion and king of the Middle East. I don't think we're going to ever get China by the throat, nor do I think we as Americans need to do that. That's absurd. But I think we're back to where we were before. This is all about Israel and securing it and making it safe and putting it in charge of the whole region. All of this is going to fail. It has no chance of success. And this business of bombing a nation into the Stone Age, I must say, I do disagree with one thing you said. You said, well, Dresden, we can't do what we did there. No, I think we can. And I think the Iranians know this. And their cities already show evidence for it. We're doing things that we have not done since the Second World War or Vietnam. And one could argue that our bombings, both we and the Royal Air Force during World War II, committed war crimes. And you can make the argument that we did the same thing in Vietnam. And I think we're going to do the same thing here. Ultimately, you end up destroying power. You put hospitals out of business. The Israelis have been bombing hospitals in Iran and emergency centers ever since the war began. And they launched a number of strikes last night, I think because they worry that they might end up facing a ceasefire. I don't think there's any chance of a ceasefire coming. I think what they're going to end up facing is something worse than they've already encountered from Iran and potentially others that support Iran. He's in this escalatory trap. He doesn't know how to do anything else but bully. So what he's trying to do is bully once again. Remember, we talked about, if it fails, what else do you do? Well, you escalate. Well, you could turn around and say, well, escalation isn't the answer. But there's no one telling him to do that as far as I can tell. And I certainly don't see great evidence for people standing up in the Department of Defense and telling him, sir, this is not going to work. And if you do this,